my privilege and pleasure and honor to give you one of the men that we're proud of in his association with BYU. I trust you don't ever have to meet him in his official capacity, but never hesitate to go and meet him in friendship and for advice. One of the men that have made BYU what it is, and of whom we're greatly proud. Chief Cleon Skousen.
Thank you, Brother Pardoll. I am delighted to have an opportunity to spend a few minutes with you tonight on this Thanksgiving Eve. As Brother Pardoll was reminiscing just a little over the years that he saw BYU become the institution that many people had dreamed and planned about, I too thought of many faces and persons that had shaped my life who came from this campus. I didn't have the privilege of doing my undergraduate work at BYU. I came up through college during the Depression. So when I came to BYU, it was where most of my relatives had come to school, and I was glad to come here. And I'd known of Dr. T. Earl Pardoll for many years by name. And there are many people now who are prominent in our country who received their initial speech training and obtained their self-confidence on the stage as a result of his fine directing. So I feel honored to have been introduced by you tonight, Brother T. Earl. He and I had the privilege of giving a few speeches around Southern California back in 1951 to tell them that there was a university up in the mountains called Brigham Young University. And all of the alums from USC and UCLA sat around and tuned in their ears, and they said, oh, you mean that Provo school? So we had the mission of spreading the word, and because California was home, I was just thrilled with the way the folks in California responded. And it wasn't long until the ward right next to ours there in Glendale maintained the highest rate of students per ward of any ward in the church outside of Provo proper. So the spirit really caught on. It's pretty thrilling, too, to come back to the campus and see in stone and steel and brick the things we used to sit around here at midnight and talk about and draw plans about and sit in committees upon and try to decide whether it should be thus and so and have a great time planning it, and to now see what the tithing of the church has done. This could have been done 50 years ago. But only in this generation has the percentage of the tithing been sufficient so that the church could move up in strength. This is the key to it, obedience to the commandments of God. And there just isn't anything that we can't accomplish if we are loyal to the program and the plan that our Heavenly Father set up. But if we're mediocre and if we just sort of fool around with this wonderful thing we have instead of work at it, then we get mediocrity instead of excellence. And I see nothing here now but excellence, and we're grateful to the whole church for having made this dream come true. When I was a little fellow, we didn't have comics books to read, but we used to have Tarzan of the Apes. And I had all 15 volumes of Tarzan of the Apes. And it was rather disconcerting to my father to find me awake reading Tarzan of the Apes at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning. I do remember that on one occasion he took the whole set out to camp. We were a construction family, build railroads and highways, and in those days we did it with mules, and it was harder work than driving trucks and bulldozers. And everybody had to go to bed at 9 o'clock at night, and then they got them all up at 4 in the morning. So lights were out at 9 o'clock. And I noticed that Dad brought these books back after about a month, and I was delighted to have them, even though I had to climb up on a high shelf to get them back. But I was quite interested to hear him tell Mother that the reason he brought them back was so he wouldn't go bankrupt. He said, the horses or mules would wake me up, and I'd get up at about 2 or 3 in the morning, here all the lights were on. I'd go through the tents, they're all reading Tarzan of the Apes. So you had to get those books out of there. Well, Dad used to encourage me to read other things. He'd say, read the Bible. That's great. And I'd say, I will. But I got to get Tarzan out of this mess. He's in an awful mess. There was one thing I learned about Tarzan, and I want to use that as my theme tonight. Tarzan, in each book, does the same thing. He does it in different places and under different circumstances, but it's always the same thing. Tarzan always has to rescue a girl. And we take 15 chapters to do it. We lose her in the very first chapter, and we don't get her back till the last one. Well, the interesting procedure that he would follow would be to come back to the apes who raised him. All of you know a little bit about Tarzan, no doubt, having been shipwrecked in Africa while the apes found him and raised him after his parents were drowned. So he spoke ape language and so forth, and what the author Edgar Rice Burroughs really did was to attribute to these apes some very interesting human qualities. So every time this girl would get in difficulty and captured by a tribe or something or other, she was always being captured, Tarzan would come through the trees and he'd come down to his family of apes and he'd get them all around him and he'd say, the girl, we got to go get the girl. And he'd explain it to them and they'd say, So they all go up into the trees and they swing along and they're really going. This is in the second chapter. I wonder what's going to happen in the rest of the book. All of a sudden, one of them would give a big loud grunt or something, and down they'd all come out of the trees, and because one of them had found a fat, fuzzy little grub just going under a log. And so they all scrambled, turn over rocks, turn over logs, and they're all eating worms, little grubs. So Tarzan, he's swinging through the trees, he looks around, no apes. So he goes back and he gathers them around and explains to them, it's very important, so you got to go down and get the girl. And they all go up in the trees again, and away they go. Well, that's what takes 15 chapters. They were always being distracted and diverted from the task at hand. Now, it just so happens that an ape doesn't have that much mentality, but human beings do. It's human beings that you gather together and say, remember? Oh, yeah, we're all for it. You just barely get them going down the trail, and sometimes it's baseball season, so just 1,000 things that distract us, but we get off the track this way and that way, and then somebody has to come and get us all together again, and, oh, yes, the girl, and then we'll go down again. Because this is typical of human behavior, it creates one of our most important problems insofar as protecting ourselves against the enemies of society are concerned. And so tonight, I'm going to talk just a little bit about it, because if certain people have their way, we only have 11 more Thanksgivings to celebrate. Now, there are a lot of people that don't think this is possible. There are a lot of the rest of us that hope it isn't possible. But there are 923 million human beings who wouldn't have believed it possible not so many years ago, who now don't celebrate a free Thanksgiving. Back in 1953, Army intelligence intercepted a communication going to Moscow from Peiping, China. And when it was brought back and translated, it was found to be the communist timetable of conquest. Now, the things that they were planning to do by 1958, 1960, 1965, 1970, all sounded fantastic in 1953. The interesting thing is, they're almost up to date on that timetable. They don't feel discouraged at all. And they smile at us as we talk about our prosperity and we came out of the recession, and they say, fine, go ahead and enjoy it. You've just got about 11 more years of it. I want to talk a little bit about this tonight because I don't know how you feel about it, but as for me and my house, I want to have Thanksgiving after 1970. Now, the only reason we're celebrating Thanksgiving tonight is because we have a lot of people who are willing to fight and die, and a lot of people who are willing to work and stand for something. Back in World War II, I read occupation orders for the United States as late as 1943, which the Germans had drawn up. And I want to tell you, if they had won this war or that war, this United States wouldn't be anything like it is today. It was just fantastic what they intended to do to destroy this nation and to occupy it and take it over. Now we have others with the same ambition. I tell you this by way of preface because it was while I was on this campus that I tried to complete a work that I had been attempting to complete while I was with the FBI. I spent about 12 years trying to take the problem of communism and put it down in a compact distilled form where a person could read it and then put it aside and pick up a morning newspaper and be able to angle what was happening in the world themselves without having to have someone outside interpret it. Those of us in the FBI had to go through extensive training in counterintelligence, and we found that there were experts who not only knew these people, knew how they would think, but actually angled what the United States should do. Only we didn't. We didn't do any of the things that these experts said would have been smart. And as a result, we paid a tremendous penalty. And I used to say to myself during World War II, if there are Americans smart enough to figure out the answers, we certainly ought to be smart enough to get it disseminated among our people. And when I asked one of these experts why we didn't distribute this information, he said, because it's not in any form that you can give to the public yet. And he said, you'll appreciate that after you've read about 175 volumes of dialectical materialism. And I said, well, start me out on a symposium. Let me kind of get my teeth into it. He says, there isn't any symposium. Nobody has written one. Well, this is crazy. This isn't possible. And yet it was true. And as a result, down through the years, all Army intelligence personnel, FBI personnel, naval intelligence personnel, and professors in political science have been wading through a lot of material and hoping that they were properly interpreting the double talk. And so during those 12 years, a number of us did the research which we hoped would bring this down into a package where a person could actually get sufficiently well acquainted with this so you could sit across from a communist and convert him. Now, when you sit across the table from a communist, you talk about the dignity of man, the Declaration of Independence, the great free United States, he just grunts. Dignity of man. With 3/4 of the human race starving, badly housed. You talk about the freedom and dignity of man? You spout empty phrases. We learned through experience that you could sit across the table from a communist, a sincere intellectual communist, and make a fine American out of him if you could just talk his language. Not America's language, the communist language. And you needed to be able to talk about the law of negation and of transformation and Hegelian dialectics. And then he followed you. Because communism turns out to be one of the most fantastically persuasive philosophies you will find outside of the truth. Many people have been astonished that well-educated, loyal, apparently loyal Americans would switch and become patrons of this cult. All you have to do is get close to this thing, and if you yourself do not have a sound philosophy, this thing proves to be very seductive, impressive philosophy. That's why Dr. Boyer went for it. I went to the same schools J. Robert Oppenheimer went to. I received some of the same indoctrination. I can see how he thought that this maybe was the great white hope of the world. I tell you just this much now, before going through some of this material quickly, so that you'll get a little perspective here on how it would be possible not to have Thanksgiving in the United States, or anywhere in the world for that matter, after 1970. Now, I want you to remember it because there's some other people in the world that sit up late at night planning against the possibility of your continuing to enjoy a Thanksgiving in a free country. it would perhaps be appropriate to just start out with some of our efforts, our attempts here to share the knowledge that was so difficult to digest and which, once digested, is entirely understandable, by saying, first of all, that we wanted to have our fellow Americans understand that in this land of ours we're competing against a criminal mind. Many people don't know what a criminal mind is really like. Criminal mind is a super egotistical mind. It's a mind that figures that he is sufficiently superior so that he shouldn't have to work like other people. I mean, that's for the common man. Now, the criminal mind is the one who knows he's just smart enough to take advantage of the suckers. This is a real criminal mind. For example, if you aren't familiar with professional criminal types, if you invited a criminal into your home for Thanksgiving dinner, he's just out of the point of the mountain, he knows that you know he's a professional criminal. So as he comes into your home, you pat him on the back and say, "Welcome, Joe. We're glad to have you here." And he looks around. Very nice place. He notices that you shake hands with him rather firmly, like you really meant it. So he sits at the dinner and he looks at the goblets and the nice silverware and the nice china and notices where they get it from and looks around. And then he looks across the table at you. And he knows that no one with any intelligence would have invited a professional criminal inside of his house. And so as he looks around all these nice things, he knows you're not really smart, you've just been lucky. And you really don't deserve to keep it. And he spends the rest of his evening figuring out how best to get back into the place to share the wealth. Now, this is the way a criminal mind works. And anyone familiar with the last 100 years of communist leadership will recognize precisely this kind of mind at work. The thing that impressed me while I was studying in the FBI was the fact that there is a way to stop communism without a major war, if we move in time. And that's what Americans don't know. That's why we get all fuzzy in our thinking and keep falling into booby traps. And so that's the way we began our study with this declaration. It is entirely possible to finish the 20th century with every human being free. Isn't it phenomenal that for the first time in the history of the human race, it is technologically possible to feed, clothe, and house adequately every human being alive? And yet we have 1/3 of the population in poverty and slavery. This does not make sense. I'm sure the God of heaven never intended it this way. Now, there's a way to change this situation if enough people know about it and how to move. And so we moved into our next chapter, which is called The Founders of Communism, and this is really designed to let people become acquainted with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. These characters are not the ones that I got in my college training when I was in California. The Karl Marx and the Friedrich Engels we present here are right out of their communist biographies. The communists have no apologies for these two persons. They present them just as they lived, as two-fisted, red-blooded anarchists and revolutionists. They were not 19th century reformers. There was nothing they would have sacrificed by way of theory or conscience to achieve power. And so no communist will criticize this chapter. And you'll notice down in the footnotes, these are all communist texts, as they present these rather wild, ruthless, reckless personalities who plotted dialectical materialism in a fiendishly clever way. So that Dr. Boyer up in Canada, when he had it presented to him, said, "I do believe this is the hope of the world. Here is the first sample of fissionable material I've been able to get from Los Alamos in New Mexico." And that's when the first part of the atomic secret left the United States, or left the Allies. They converted him from a loyal Canadian to an espionage agent for Russia in 3 hours. Therefore, we thought it would be very desirable to have Americans understand why intelligent people are converted to this. You can understand how maybe some people under the influence of a rabble-rousing speech might do it, but it's fantastic that highly educated people would do it. And so we present the whole philosophy of communism, the appeal of communism. I had an interesting thing happen. A university professor called me and he said, I read the appeal of communism and turned out the light, and as I did so, I said to my wife, those people have got something. He says, then the next morning at class, before a class, I read the critique and found I had really been brainwashed. He says, that's a dangerous book you've got there. He says, what if people stop right there in the middle of the discussion? Well, we wanted people to see communism as the communists present it. It is persuasive. And then when you get to the critique, you find that there's nothing to it. So then we present the communist approach to the solution of world problems. Now, in this case, another friend of ours had a similar experience, in that he said that he was quite persuaded at the completion of that chapter that while you wouldn't agree with everything the communists stood for, there, no doubt about it, there was a lot of good in their program. And that's the way we wanted to present it. In the next chapter, which is a brief critique on the communist approach, the 25 fallacies are presented one at a time, and there isn't one single thing in the communist philosophy for the solution of world problems that will hold up under scrutiny. Not even one. And people like to feel they're scientific and objective, so what they do is they go to communism and they say, now this is good, and this sounds pretty good, and this sounds pretty good. Of course, we're not going to do it, but they sound pretty good. The communists love us to do that, because it gives them some kind of a warp and woof in which they can build their espionage friendships. We then decided to present communism as it was lived, that is the actual history of it. And we start out with the rise of the revolutionary movement in Russia. Now, the reason we did this was so that if you ever talk to a communist, a real sincere intellectual communist, you could talk about the things he understands. He talks about the October Manifesto and the Revolution of 1905 and so forth, and these things Americans never heard about, and he knows we're ignorant. When the very finest rebuttal against communism is in that same history. When Lenin took over Russia in 1917, he determined to subject it to all of Marxist theory, and so he confiscated all property, confiscated industry, he collectivized the farms. And do you know that within 3 years, production in Russia was 13% of what it was before the war? 33 million people were starving, 5 million had died, and the United States was feeding 10 million. Do you remember that out of your school books? Do you know who overthrew the Tsar? The communists? I came out of school thinking they did. This was on a $64,000 question not so long ago, and somebody muffed it. Most Americans don't know that the communists had nothing to do with the overthrow of the Tsar. The Tsar of Russia was overthrown by Russia's very best people. Where were the communists? Well, Lenin was in exile in Switzerland, and Stalin was in prison in Siberia, and Trotsky was in exile in New York. What a place to be exiled. And for about 7 months or 8 months, they had a pretty good government going in Russia. They were trying to bring it back. So what the communists did was form a counter-revolution with the assistance of the agents of the German Kaiser, and what they overthrew was the nearest thing to democracy the Russians had ever had. They were on the way to building a democracy when that provisional government was overthrown. We felt our Americans should have this refreshed in their mind, so that we could remember this history the way it really happened. How many of you would have believed a communist propagandist if he had come to the university and said, while we have not caught up with the United States, nevertheless the Russian peasant is so much better off today than he was under the Tsar? Now, I know when I came out of school in California, I would have said, yeah, I'm sure of that. Now, the clear fact is that the Russian people aren't nearly as well off as they would have been under a democracy, and that's what they had when the communists took over. So we go through that period and on up to 33. I go very rapidly here just to give you an idea of what our problem is so I can talk about these next 11 years that are ahead of us. In 1933, we were in a depression, and so the circumstances in Moscow were very propitious for us. Stalin was about to be liquidated. During the Christmas season of December 1932, the Russian Politburo was about to overthrow Stalin. See, we never heard about that. And Molotov told him to hang on, not resign. He says, just hang on a few months. Maybe we can change things. And so Stalin held on, and things did change. Two things. Hitler rose to power with a strong anti-Russian policy, and Stalin got us to recognize his government. He did that by sending over a man named Maxim Litvinov. And Maxim Litvinov said, we have decided that we will not try to overthrow the United States government by violence anymore. We've decided that's not good. And our president said, well, glad to hear you say it. And the next thing he said was, and we're not going to allow anybody in Russia to advocate the overthrow of the United States government by violence. We're just not going to tolerate it. And our president says, well, that's good too. And he said, in fact, if any Americans want to travel in Russia, they'll be treated just as well as though they were traveling in the United States. And then he said, will you recognize us? Well, our president and Secretary of State said, this looks good. Looks like they're abandoning world revolution. And so we recognized Russia. Within 10 months, we knew we'd been defrauded. Everything that they'd promised, we now knew was a fraud. In fact, right at that moment, Whittaker Chambers was in Washington setting up espionage circles in the Army, White House, Navy. They didn't have a Pentagon then, but what was then headquarters. All this was being set up by Whittaker Chambers right at the time Maxim Litvinov was making his promises. So then we had to decide whether to coexist or to drop down one notch. And that's what we decided to do. We decided to coexist plus accepting their abuse and their repudiation of their promises. So we went along like that until the beginning of World War II. Now, most people don't know it, but Stalin took complete credit for starting World War II. And he did it this way. In 1938, were we afraid of the Russians and communism? No, we were not. Who were we afraid of in 1938? You won't remember, but it was Adolf Hitler. History and poli-sci majors will remember. It was Adolf Hitler. Nobody's afraid of Russia. Next to Germany, they're the best armed country in the world. They happen to be the balance of power, but the Russian bear isn't roaring. Just Hitler. And Hitler had taken Czechoslovakia in 1938 through the Munich Pact, and now he was ready for Poland. And it was in this moment that he did not dare take Poland because he was afraid Russia would object. And so the groundwork was laid, and Stalin and Hitler joined together in a pact. Whittaker Chambers and the spies and communists in America said it took them 3 days to get their presses in reverse. Over here, they'd been presenting Stalin as the great protector of the democracies against Hitler and the fascist powers. All of a sudden, here's Stalin reaching out and shaking hands with Hitler and saying, we will join a neutrality pact, which meant that Hitler could go ahead and wage war in the West without interference. And when the generals of the Russian army came to Stalin and said, are you crazy? He said, this is the smartest thing we could do, because what will happen? The West will fight itself into exhaustion. Soviet troops will take over all of Europe without hardly firing a bullet. Oh, they said, that's a good idea. That sounds all right. Did it work? You bet it worked. And by 1941, we had all Western Europe flat on the ground in the dust. The only one of the European countries of power actually surviving was England, and that was only by sweat, blood, and tears. This pact had really worked. Now Stalin sat back and he said, I need the last two big capitalist countries in this war. Who were they? Japan, the United States. How did he get us in the war? This is the way he says he did it. On April the 14th, 1941, he went to the Japanese, who had been expanding into Manchuria, China, and establishing all of their industrial developments there. The very Manchuria that they had fought the war with Russia in 1905 over. And Stalin comes to the Japanese and says to Tojo, want to be friends? You do? Yes, neutrality pact. I got some business I want to do up north. If I get in a war, I don't want you to interfere. If you want to take over China, Philippines, I won't interfere. You won't? No. Oh, that's good. Fai ni kasui. So, they signed a pact. And it took Tojo and the Japanese warlords from April the 14th until December the 7th to make their attack. Now, the astonishing thing about it was that Hitler had already decided to double-cross Stalin. We're talking about the year 41 now. And it's interesting that when two gangsters like this sit down together and make up a pact, it's exactly like a couple of gangsters dividing up Chicago. They'll sit across the table from each other, and one of them will say, Joe, plenty of room for both of us. And the other one says, you're right, Mike. We'll be friends. Make this the dividing line. Good. I don't get in your territory. You don't get in mine. No shooting, no trouble. We don't heat up the town. Fine. Good. Now, the genius of being a gangster is to sit at a table like that and make that bargain, each of you knowing that you're going to double-cross the other, but each of you knowing that you can do it before the other one thinks to do it. Now, that's the way you survive as a gangster. You always double-cross the other fellow just before he's going to double-cross you. And it's the double-crossers that win all the time. Well, it was exactly the same way with Stalin and Hitler. Now, Stalin expected to double-cross Hitler. And as late as June the 20th, 1941, the British ambassador was warning both Molotov and Stalin that Hitler was going to attack Russia. And both Molotov and Stalin said, no, they are our friends. On the 22nd day of June, 1941, the German panzer units went into reverse and attacked Russia on a 2,000-mile front with 3 million men and thousands of planes. And Russia was completely caught off guard. Stalin was double-crossed. A scorched earth policy was initiated. Thousands and thousands of Russians died. In spite of that, within 5 months, the Germans were within 62 miles of Moscow and had occupied territory ordinarily occupied by a third of the Russian population. Now, when this war between Russia and Germany started, we in America thought it was great. Here were the two great aggressor nations in a death struggle. And I was in Washington at the time, and I can remember as the admirals and generals sat around, they said, well, this will take the starch out of both of them. This is great for the free world. But after 5 months, everybody's tune changed. All across the country. By October of 1941, we were very concerned about the fact that there might be a Nazi empire from England to Alaska. Germany was winning, and Russia was going down. Now, we Americans are funny people. We do strange things. It's odds it's going to be difficult for us to explain some things to our children. And this will be one of them. Here are two great nations fighting. The one that's being beaten happens to be the one that started this fracas in the first place. We don't remember that. We're great folks for the underdog. When two people are fighting, we don't say who's right, we say who's losing. Cheer for the underdog. It's a great American custom. Always cheer for the underdog. Well, that's what happened. And our sympathy extended itself to Russia. So that when we were struck 2 months later, at Pearl Harbor, we put our arms right out to Russia and said, we are brothers. Now, in Washington at this time, there were a group of people that I'm going to call diplomatic strategists. I have to hurry very rapidly here, but try to cover the ground. They were not Democrats, and they were not Republicans. They were not independents even. They were diplomatic strategists. If you'd gone to dinner with them, you would have heard them say that one day America will become a great, rich, peaceful Soviet land. Not under Russia necessarily, but a Sovietized United States was ultimately going to solve all of our economic and social problems. They were very sincere. They would work day and night to put this into practice. And they did. So here's what happened. They sold us, sold our Congress and others, on reaching a hand out to Russia and giving them $11 billion worth of lend-lease. Congress authorized $8 billion. $3 billion was sort of thrown in. It was illegal, but generosity in high places. As a result, Russia was saved. We preserved Russia with lend-lease. One half of all the rolling vehicles, all the rolling stock in Russia was made in American factories. At a time when their troops were about to be turned back just because they were starving to death, we used planes to fly the food to them that helped them hold the line. Otherwise, they would have gone down under Hitler's impact. This we should not forget. At the end of that war, we were never thanked for our lend-lease. And one of these diplomatic strategists flew to Moscow to plead with Stalin to please thank the American people, just in the name of good public relations. And what Stalin said to that diplomatic strategist was like a physical, brutal blow in the face. He said, we will not thank them. They have stopped sending it. That's just the way he felt. Now, right in the middle of World War II, and included in our Lend-Lease program, was one half of all the uranium salts that we developed. These diplomatic strategists gave away the atomic bomb. They got some of it through espionage, but they really didn't have to. And we now know that about one half of all uranium salts were given to them. The secrets of the atomic bomb were given to them, but then they couldn't explode it. And neither could we. The bloomin' thing wouldn't go off. We had it developed by 1944, and we couldn't set the thing off. And so some ingenious fellow down at Los Alamos developed a lens device, a very tricky device. It would have taken the Russians 15 to 20 years to have stumbled onto it. He just happened to hit it, and the chances were, they think, 1 in 200,000 or 300,000 that one would stumble onto. Is a very illogical device. Didn't fit the mathematics nor the chemistry of the bomb, nor the physics either. But it worked. Pragmatically, it worked. If we could have kept that, we'd have been all right. But there was a man named Rossinger, and there was a man named Greenglass, and the Rosenbergs. You've heard of all of these folks, I'm sure. And a man named Harry Gold. And Greenglass was the brother-in-law of the Rosenbergs. And they put the pressure on him to steal the lens. They got it, shipped it to Russia. And even so, it took 5 more years before Russia could make their bomb explode. But they finally did in 1949. Russia had it. Now, all of this was unnecessary. But that's what happened. As we came to the close of World War II, the diplomatic strategists decided they had won the friendship of the Russians, that now the Russians would go along with us in building a world of peace. And so they were invited to join the United Nations. How many of you have ever read the Charter of the United Nations? Beginning to end. 1, 2, 3. Well, that's more than I usually find. I didn't read it till 1948. Let me tell you a little bit about the United Nations Charter. Do you know it's copied after the Russian Constitution of 1936? Did you know that the man who was responsible for writing the charter was alluring, executive secretary of the commission to form the United Nations? Did you know that? So what did you expect to get out of it? Here's what you've got. You've got a document that promises free people everything they want to hear in about the first 3 sections, and then takes it all away in the little print way back in the back of the charter. And most Americans are headline readers. We never get past the 3rd section. That's how stupid they think we are. We're not really stupid. We are smart, but we're so trusting, and they know that. So here's what we've got in the United Nations Charter. It promises self-determination, equal representation. Those sound familiar? Think that's desirable? Where have you got equal representation and self-determination? You have it in the General Assembly. And here's this great body of august nations, all properly represented, and their nameplates are in front of their desks, and they all sit there in the greatest dignity, in the most profound manner, give their speeches and have it interpreted in about 7 different languages, and do not have any power at all to legislate. Isn't that great? As chairman of the United Nations Committee of the International Juvenile Officers Association on Social Defense. So when I speak about the United Nations, I am not against the United Nations. But I am not satisfied with the United Nations, and I think it's time we use Section 110, which permits the entire Charter to be rewritten. We're at that stage of our development in world government where the Articles of Confederation had the colonies. Do you think we could have ever built a great nation without the Constitution? We couldn't have built it on the Articles of Confederation. And I'll tell you, the Charter is a poor Articles of Confederation even. So when you talk about United Nations, talk about it with your eyes open and your ears. We got a weak instrument there that needs to be strengthened. Right after the end of World War II, there was fighting in only one remaining place in the world. That was China. Chiang Kai-shek was trying to put down the communist Chinese. There were only a handful of them. They were way up in the corner of China. But the Russians had taken over Manchuria. We allowed them to do that at Yalta. What was Manchuria? Why, it was this wonderfully developed, industrialized section of China built by the Japanese during occupation. Chiang Kai-shek says, I must get to that territory. It will be the heart of the new economy of China when we have set up our democracy. So what happens? The Russians took over all of Manchuria and stripped it of all of its industry. So that when China finally got it, it was not only stripped, but it was occupied by red Chinese. And Chiang Kai-shek says, this is no good. I'm going to make them put down their arms and come in and like men and sit in council as we set up our constitution and our democracy. So he went up to do it. And the diplomatic strategists in Washington said, this is not going to be allowed. No fighting. Verboten. No good to fight. And so they sent the most popular military leader in the United States over to stop Chiang Kai-shek from fighting. You remember who it was? General Marshall. Maybe he went over and said, now, Chiang Kai-shek, you must not fight. We don't want to fight anymore. And Chiang Kai-shek says, that's right. Just as soon as I put these robbers down. You're going to let me do that? No, you're not going to be allowed to do that. Cease fire. So Chiang Kai-shek did. He said, I just want them to sit in with us as we form our constitution. Now, here's an interesting thing. Chiang Kai-shek had been a dictator for many years in China with one purpose in mind, and that was to set up a democracy. And now was the time when he could turn China over to the people. And so a constitution was being prepared. And do you know who was one of those most responsible for the writing of that constitution? Dr. Wu on this faculty. I guess he's still on the faculty. Dr. Wu still here? Well, that was his assignment. And they got a constitution. And on Christmas Day 1946, they adopted a constitution. And then the Red Chinese broke out into warfare. And our diplomatic strategist said to Chiang Kai-shek, don't fight back. He said, I have to fight back. They're taking over a lot more land. No, no fight. If you had read Owen Lattimore, who was one of the experts that was counseling in the State Department at that time, you would have heard him say in the New York papers, the thing to do is to lose China and South Korea. Let them fall, but don't let it look as though we pushed them. And Chiang Kai-shek got caught in that. So he says, I have to fight. And so he started doing it. And you know what the diplomatic strategists did? They said, Chiang Kai-shek, you are through. And they stripped him of all American aid. He said, you can't do this. We are on the verge of a democracy. We will undoubtedly be conquered. They said, with American power, we armed you. With a stroke of the pen, we disarmed you. And they did. Chiang Kai-shek sent his wife over to plead with the American people to wake up to what was happening. We shook her hand and wined her and dined her and sent her home. Nothing happened. So for 4 years, Chiang Kai-shek stood on the trembling brink. And in 1948, the inevitable downfall of China came about. This is the first time the Americans had awakened to what had really happened. 48 and 49, China collapsed. Chiang Kai-shek barely got 1 million men on the island of Formosa, and down she went. The American people said, who pulled that bungle? What a booba that was. There's one of the greatest allies that America ever had. How did we lose her to Russia? So right away the diplomatic strategists prepared what we call the White Paper of 1949, in which they tried to apologize for it. It's been completely discredited, even by those who were once the friends of the diplomatic strategists who were there. In 1950, the Secretary of State, by name Dean Acheson, whose law partner was Donald Hiss, and who in the early 30s was the law firm. Dean Acheson, Donald Hiss, was the law firm that represented Russia in the United States for all their purchasing. Now he's Secretary of State. In 1950, this is what he said. Neither Formosa nor South Korea are within the perimeter of defense of the United States of America. And I was in Washington at the time, and everyone who knew anything about it said, what in the world is he doing, inviting disaster for those people? And he then said, if they are attacked, they must first rely upon themselves, secondly upon the United Nations. They must not rely upon the United States. That's all the Red Chinese needed to know. And so from Moscow came the word to the Red Koreans and to the Red Chinese to get prepared to take Formosa and to take South Korea. So the Red Koreans struck first. And what was it? 26th of June, 1950. And there were no American troops there. The closest ones were in Japan. And so they came pouring over the 38th parallel, and Sigmund Rhee sent word to the United Nations, to President Truman, and to General MacArthur, help, help, we're in trouble. President Truman overruled the whole diplomatic corps and ordered General MacArthur into Korea. And these people literally tore their hair. And President Truman says, there's some things I don't understand about diplomacy, but this is one thing I understand. Our friends are being attacked, and they are not going to go unprotected and undefended. So General MacArthur got in there with a few troops, and what was he able to save? 70 miles of beachhead, 7 miles deep. That's Busan. And then the diplomatic strategists succeeded in cutting off all aid to MacArthur. Now, you might not think that's possible, but it was possible. That happened. And MacArthur found himself caught, and he saw the American boys being slaughtered. We were not getting our troops over in time. The material was not arriving, and so he took a very desperate gamble. There was one place where it would have been impossible for troop ships to have landed. That was up along the western coast of the Korean peninsula, not very far from Seoul. And the reason you couldn't land there was because the tide fell 23 feet against bare cliffs. And of course the Red Koreans knew that if there was any invasion force, it wouldn't be there. And so that's why MacArthur chose it. It was called Incheon. And that's where the American troops landed in the name of the United Nations. And they cut right straight across the peninsula of Korea, cut off all of the Red Korean supply lines, and then our people down at the south began to close in, and the Great Pincher Movement completely defeated and destroyed the flower of the North Korean army. It was one of the greatest military victories in American history. And General MacArthur radioed to Washington, "Now do you want me to go up and mop up and unite Korea and hand it back to the United Nations?" He said, "Oh, no, don't go up there. That's not our territory, you know. That's North Korea." He said, "I know, but that's the enemy. We're going to go after the enemy, aren't we?" And they said, "Oh, no, that's bad. We mustn't do that." Well, he said, "I'll tell you this much. Unless you give me specific orders not to go and publish the fact and take the wrath of the American people for not allowing me to go, I am going." And of course they were smart enough not to wire back. They just sat quiet. And so the ROKs went up the east coast, the UN went up the west coast. They got clear up to the Yalu River, and that's when the signal came to the Red Chinese to attack across the Yalu River. This was a complete surprise for very obvious reasons. MacArthur knew they wouldn't dare attack, because in his planes in Japan were planes equipped with bombs carrying atomic warheads. He could have just blasted that whole railroad from stem to stern. And he knew the Chinese were smarter than to attack in Korea, because he would be able to attack with atomic bombs on the mainland of China and completely wipe them out, he thought. What he didn't know was that the diplomatic strategists had tied up both the United Nations and thinking in Washington sufficiently so that everybody had agreed that if the Chinese came across the Yalu River and attacked in Korea, MacArthur would not be allowed to retaliate except in Korea. He wasn't even allowed to bomb out the Yalu Bridge. And reconnaissance planes flew over that bridge, watched the materiel and manpower pour across, and were forbidden by the diplomatic strategists to bomb it and to cut it off. You think we can explain this to our children? It's absolutely ridiculous. Do you think the communist leadership is encouraged? Do you think they speak of us as a stupid people, incapable of defending ourselves against the timetable of conquest they've set up for us? I have sat and listened to them call us stupid. Well, as all of you know, we were driven back down to the 38th parallel, and by December of 1950, that's where we were. From December till April, General MacArthur sat and watched American lives butchered. And he wasn't allowed to do anything. Just sit and take it almost. So in April, a congressman in Washington wrote and asked General MacArthur for a report on why, after we had won a war, we were now taking such a beating. And General MacArthur put the whole story out on paper, sent it to the congressman. It was read on the floors of Congress, and the United States blew up. And General MacArthur was relieved of all commands for having told it. Does that sound like confusion? Does that sound like mixed up thinking? It was. Now, all of this is to the good if we don't repeat these mistakes. We are dealing with a very clever and astute enemy. This is a criminal mind we are dealing with. This is a mind that we give $11 billion worth of wealth to, and he does not thank us because we stop giving him any more. This is an individual who says, if you'll just let me surround myself with 1 million buffer countries so that I won't be afraid of the democracies and can feel secure while I'm growing up politically, I will not be aggressive. and then turns right around and takes another 600 million. That's the criminal mind you're dealing with. This is good for Americans to know on this Thanksgiving evening of 1958. Because after the Korean War was over, America repudiated coexistence as we were then living it. And we turned from coexistence to co-resistance. And it's been that policy ever since. This just scares the wits out of some Americans. Co-resistance, you think we might have a war? Well, who wants a war? Nobody wants a war. You know why the policemen are trained with .45 caliber machine guns? So they won't get killed, that's why. And why they go out with shotguns that carry .00 buck? Every time they go off, 9 shots, each one equal to the size of a .32 caliber bullet goes out the end of that barrel. You know why they carry those? So they won't have to use them. You go out with a pea shooter, and you not only have to use it, you get hurt besides. You go out with a shotgun, you don't have to use it. Who wants to fool around with a shotgun staring you in the face? Well, it's just this simple when you deal with a gangster. Now, interestingly enough, you can make a friend out of a gangster. And we do it in police work all the time. And the way you do it is by gaining his respect. And how do you do that? You do it just the way we did it in Germany and Japan. Do you remember what we did? We risked everything we had to stop Tojo and Hitler cold. And we did stop them cold. We didn't compromise. We didn't coexist. We stopped them cold. Do you know who America's 2 best friends are in the world today outside of the Western Hemisphere? Western Germany and Japan. Now, this is a lesson we shouldn't forget. Those 2 nations were both under captive gangster rule. And today there are our 2 best friends because we used an intelligent approach in stopping them, teaching them, gaining their respect, and now their affection. And we do this in police work continually. You must know how to deal with a criminal mind, or we end up being as stupid as they keep thinking we are. Now, let me close fast. In 1955, you will not recall this probably. Very few Americans can remember it. But in 1955, Stalin was dead, Korean War was over. All of a sudden, the Red Chinese began to dangle in front of our faces a host of American boys illegally held in violation of the pact at Panmunjom. And I can remember what the papers said. When Mexico held our prisoners, we went in and got them. When our prisoners were being held in North Africa, we went in and got them. What will America do now? To add insult to injury, Khrushchev, who had taken over at Moscow, began to give orders down at Peiping that Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai should get the Red Chinese going for Formosa. And so in January of 55, that was the word. The Red Chinese will now take Formosa. And so the shooting began against Quemoy and Matsu and some other little islands that were taken, as a matter of fact. I gave a lecture to a convention in New York in January of 55. And during this lecture, I said, every expert on communism knows that if the United States gives in to this demand for Formosa, the free world will lose all of Southeast Asia. The experts on communism also know that if we stand up to the Red Chinese and threaten to retaliate with atomic bombs if they attack Formosa, there won't be any attack. And tension will be released all over the world. Afterwards, a very prominent man whose name you would recognize if I told you came up to me and said, Mr. Skousen, that's one of the most reckless statements I have heard from the public platform in a long time, and it's people like you who are going to start World War III. And I said, well, sir, and he was a senator. I said, what would you suggest we do? He said, we ought to feed those people. We've got surplus food, and we just ought to persuade them that they're our friends. I said, Senator, we've been trying that for 15 years, and all we lost were millions and millions of human beings to slavery. Well, he said, I tell you, there ought to be a criminal law against speakers like you that would suggest standing up against a people that are all ready to be triggered into a war. It just needs some foolhardy statement like yours to trigger it. And I said, well, I'm willing to wait on time, because we're going to do one of these two things. We'll either back down or we'll stand up to them. And I can guarantee you that if we back down, we will lose Asia. 1 month later, to the day that speech was given, President Eisenhower asked the Congress to support him in allowing him to bomb the Chinese mainland if the 7th Fleet that he was ordering into the Formosa Straits was attacked. And the Congress, both the Senate and the House, voted unanimously, with the exception of 4 communist congressmen, to support the program. As a result, on the 5th day of February, 1955, Russia and Red China got the word from Washington. You touch Formosa and we fight. You remember what happened? You probably don't. But within 6 weeks, our prisoners were on the way home, and tension had gone down all over the world, because Moscow suddenly looked across and said, what is all this talk about war? We should have a visit together at Geneva and settle these things peacefully. See what happened? And so about May of that year, a Life reporter went to Secretary Dulles and said, how in the world do you turn world tension off and on like it was a faucet that way? How did you get the communists to back down when they were calling us a paper tiger and said they would have Formosa before the end of the year? And Secretary Dulles said, I'll let you in on a little secret. They knew we would fight. The reporter says, do you mean we were on the brink of war? And Secretary Dulles said, innocently, I guess you could call it that. Brink of war! When that appeared in Life magazine, these United States just blew sky high. Secretary Dulles, do you mean you were considering the possibility of really going to war? And do you know what Moscow did? They outbluffed us. As a result, in 1958, we're having to prove it all over again. That's the only reason you've got shelling of Matsu and Quemoy. And they're pushing it right to the brink. They do not want war. They will not fight the United States. There are not going to be any intercontinental ballistic missiles flying over here from Russia. It isn't time. They're taking everything they can by bluff. And Secretary Dulles knows it. Britain knows it. We know it in Berlin and Seoul, at Lebanon, Matsu, Quemoy, Berlin. What is the word? We fight. Now, these are right out of the notebooks of the Founding Fathers. A lot of people don't know what made America great. And that's because they put peace as the ultimate goal of the human race, as the most sacred thing that a human being can have. Peace is not the most sacred thing. Peace is desirable. But there's some other things that are more desirable, like freedom. and human dignity and the protection of innocent people. These are all more important than peace. And the interesting thing about it is that if a country or a people have the spirit and the vigor of the founding fathers of the United States and love their freedom so much that they will fight for it, they don't lose it. And usually they don't even have to fight for it. That's why a peace officer goes out with a lot bigger gun than his opponent, so that the other one won't do a foolish thing and shoot, because you don't want to have to shoot. If you take a little gun, he'll take a chance. He'll say, I can stand a 38, but that 45 caliber stuff, that hurts. A 45 caliber bullet, even in the arm, has such terrific shocking power, it'll knock a person right down to the ground. 38 caliber, person can take 5 or 6 of them in the body and still live. And a criminal mind will stand there and look at the situation. He calculates it. What are my odds? If they take me, 40 years in prison. I'll take the chance. So he will try to shoot it out. If it's a shotgun, no, 40 years is better than none at all. Now this is the way it is in dealing with a gangster. And this is the way you make friends out of them. There is a way to smother communism and do it successfully within a few years. So that's actually the way we ended our text, with what the experts have said about how to stop communism without a major war. I close on the timetable of conquest. I think you'd be interested to see what they planned for our Thanksgiving in 1970. This chapter is called The Future Task. By the early 60s, they intend to have India and all of Southeast Asia, including Japan. Do you know that right now we are fooling around with the possibility of allowing a red pact, trade pact between Japan and China? And if we do, we can kiss Japan goodbye. All of Africa by 1965. Africa right now is on the brink. All of Europe by 1970. Point number 4 in this is no war with the United States until after 1970. Let me just take a moment to read this. The U.S. must be isolated by all possible means. Britain must be placated by being convinced that there is a possibility of settling the major issues between the East and West, and that the communists and capitalist countries can live in peace. Opportunities for trade will have a great influence on the British mind. And if you're following political science, you know that's our number one problem, to keep Britain with us and not trade with Russia and the Reds. We must be on guard against the possibility the United States will choose to have war. The defensive and offensive preparations of the Soviet Union and China must be completed before 1970, and then war will be inevitable. Now, it's interesting how they've planned to take us. They don't want to destroy Pittsburgh and Los Angeles and Detroit, San Francisco. They don't want any intercontinental ballistics missiles making this Western Hemisphere like the face of the moon. They want it nice and luscious, just like it is. So the idea is to try and get us in a weak space sometime during the late 60s with a monumental depression, and have our people so ill-informed about their own government that they will abandon it in that depression. This is their plan. Then they can take the country intact. Now it's time that you and I realize this danger, because this last spring we had a little recession. A little tiny recession. It wasn't anywhere near a depression. About a 3% recession. And I heard people beginning to say, there's something wrong with capitalism when things like this happen. Here we have 1/2 of the Earth's developed wealth and only 7% of the Earth's population. We get a little tiny period of sacrifice and difficulty and readjustment, and we're ready to sack the whole works and get rid of the system. We've got to be built of better stuff. President Young said, the time will come when good government in the United States will hang by a thread. And so fearful will the people be that they will turn to the elders of Israel to take over the government in order that it can survive. And the elders will be prepared and will do it. This government will not fail. There's another prophecy says that it will go through quite a threshing, however, if it doesn't try to protect itself. But it will be from the inside, not the outside. So I close on this theme because I feel that we're living in a tremendously exciting period of the earth's history. And that it's possible that other people will write about what you and I may be too busy to write about. We'll just be living it. I'm only concerned about one thing, and that is, remember, we're rescuing the girl. This happens to be the Statue of Liberty out there that we're trying to rescue in this case. If we can just keep our mind on the ball and not be distracted by the grubby, fuzzy, fat little worms, we're going to come out all right. But when circumstances call for a little sacrifice, when the message of peace says go to Africa, go to Australia, go to New England, go to Canada, we've got to have the kind of people that can handle it and do it and take it. The world is hungry for honest, knowledgeable leadership. So you have a great responsibility at this university. This happens to be the educational world headquarters for these people that Brigham Young was talking about. We've got a lot of fine candidates at the University of Utah and at the USU also, and other places around the world, but primarily you're concentrated here. These are things you're supposed to know, so that when a decision has to be made, you make a smart decision. The time will vindicate as being intelligent and wise and helpful. And if we make the right decisions, I repeat what I said when I started. The experts on communism know that it is entirely possible to smother communism without a major war, and to come toward the last quarter of the 20th century living under this monumental achievement. Freedom in our time for all people. God would have it so. It just takes leadership. And if this is our time and generation, when God intends that we shall show our worthiness to be free, I pray His blessings in making us equal to our task. I think you are a choice generation held in reserve for this mission. You're perfectly capable of doing it. All you need is the will. And if you have the knowledge, I think you'll have the will. May our Heavenly Father bless you as students. And those of us who are a little further up the trail ahead of you, that our examples may be right, our teachings sound, so that if you use them in a crisis, you'll find them holding up. And may He give us the wisdom of Solomon to make the right decisions and hear the dictates of His Spirit, I humbly pray, through Jesus Christ. Amen.
Brother Skousen, the attention given you by this audience, I'm sure, echoes their feelings and their appreciation for your coming here this evening, for making us understand more fully the responsibility that we each hold, and at this special Thanksgiving time for the many blessings that we are enjoying. Thank you, Brother Bardell. Brother Skousen, would you like to?
We called it the Naked Communist. That's not pornographic literature.
Thank you very, very much, Brother Skousen. We hope that we might have you back on the campus very soon, especially because you have a busy schedule. We know this won't be in the next few days. We appreciate it very, very much.